Hi, everybody. This is S.J. Thomason with Christian-apologist.com, and we are going to talk about why some people seem to prefer a brave new world to a Christian world. Now, what is A Brave New World? That is a book written around 1932 by Aldous Huxley. Quite prescient because a lot of the events in the book seem to be coming true at some point today. There are certain things in the book, like consumerism, that we're seeing today. And so I'm going to take a look at a few things that we're seeing that are similar. And I'm going to go back, excuse my toasty voice there. I'm going to go back to where this all begins, because what we're seeing today, what we're seeing in society very much relates to what we've seen from our past and to what we see when we realize that some people don't treat us as if we're made in the image of God. So what did God say in Genesis 1:27? God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. And Genesis 2:7 says, Then the Lord God formed the man out of dust from the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. And the man became a living creature. Now, different English translations have that word for creature is also called a person or a soul or a being. Now, what's important about that is this idea of intrinsic human value, the dignity of human life, and that human life and value are conferred by God. It is not our right to take a life. It is not our right to confer life value on others, to confer human value and dignity on others. God did not leave that to us. It says it quite clear here in Genesis. So that's what we see. Now, this goes to this idea of where am I here? This goes to the idea of intrinsic human value and dignity. So here's also what God said that implies that we have human value and dignity. I'm speaking to this because I'm going to show you what's in Brave New World that goes opposite to this. Jeremiah 1:5, God says, Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. And before you were born, I consecrated you. I appointed you a prophet to the nations. Now, what's important about that particular verse? That we have been preordained by God. We have been given special roles by God. And it's up to us in our lives to seek purpose and to seek his purpose for us. It's very important for us to do that because he's given us all a very special set of gifts. Not one person gets off this planet without a very special gift. And it's important for you to find out exactly what gift you've been given, what role God wants you to play in your human life, and the ways that you are to make sacrifices in your life toward the greater good. Now, the nice thing is that I found out is that in numerous studies, it shows that people realize that there is a golden rule that we are to do unto others as we would have done unto ourselves. This goes across all different religions. It goes across the 7 major world religions and even American atheism, this idea that we are to do for others as we would have done to ourselves. Some call it even more than that. They'll say there's a platinum rule of do unto others as you would want to have done to yourself and that sort of thing. And so Psalm 139, 13-16 also says this, For you formed my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there was none of them. Okay, so very interesting. God has preordained us. Now, some people might say from a Calvinist perspective that there's no way that you can alter all of that kind of stuff. Now, that's not how it works, because you have to realize that God is outside time. He transcends time. So he's seen our life. He's already seen it, but he's seen it because he's literally in the past, present, and future concurrently at the same time. It's very hard for us to grasp that, but that's what's going on. So what does Brave New World say? Brave New World was very interesting because the book starts off where there are a bunch of babies being manufactured outside of a womb. Now, you remember the very first test tube baby in the 1970s, and since then, a lot of babies have been formed, put together, but then put inside of a womb to be grown. But these in Brave New World, they're outside of the womb, and there are these sort of evil scientists who are playing around with the DNA of the babies, finding babies that were perfect and finding babies that were not so perfect and putting them by adding and deleting certain materials, putting them into the alpha, the beta, the gamma, and all of these different values. And the lower level values, they called the caste system, kind of similar to India's caste system. The lower level castes were given the worst roles in society, and they were conditioned by constantly being given these words while they were sleeping. While they were sleeping, they would hear words repeated into their heads to condition them for and against certain things. And they even did things like they would haul a bunch of babies in front of, a pile of beautiful roses and beautiful books of beautiful colors and all this kind of stuff. And then they would have screaming in the background, and they would do that multiple times to a baby to horrify the baby and get the baby to understand that you never want to read books. You don't want to be around flowers. You don't want to see beautiful nature. Your whole purpose is to go and dig ditches or whatever it was. So anyway, that's what Brave New World was about. And it took this idea to the extremes. It had savage groups, which was in Indian groups in the Americas, basically in New Mexico. So it had the people in the Brave New World who were just artificially in pleasure all the time. They would take these soma pills to maximize their pleasure, and they were sexually immoral. They were taught never to form relationships because they didn't come from a family relationship. They were taught not to form relationships with others. There wasn't the mother, father, baby formation of a relationship, and there certainly wasn't a sibling relationship, and there definitely wasn't a marital relationship. They were discouraged from getting married, having kids. In fact, they thought it was grotesque to give birth to a baby, and they would abort any babies if people accidentally got themselves pregnant. They would actually forcibly sterilize certain castes in this group too. And so there's a lot of really pretty gross stuff going on. But the idea in this book was sexual immorality was heightened, and purity and sanctity of the marital relationship, that was not something that was valued. The acquisition of goods. Instead of repairing any of your goods, they constantly had these little things repeated in their heads where, no, you just throw away all of your older goods. And it was consumerism. And that was sort of versus the vows of poverty and taking care of your materials, taking care of what bit you have, but not to have too much. There was materialism versus supernaturalism. In the Brave New World, they actually didn't really pray to God. Instead, what they did was they worshiped Ford, which I think was Henry Ford, which is super strange. So they would worship Ford, worshiping a man, and they would worship themselves as their own gods. And anytime they got into any sort of difficulties or needed perseverance, needed to achieve, they would be taking these soma pills, which were kind of like drinking alcohol or smoking pot, but the difference was they wouldn't get hungover, they wouldn't have any negative effects of it, and it would clean out their heads of any thoughts that would be negative. No suffering. Okay, that was the Brave New World. The idea was they would live from 1 to 60, and at 60 they would all die, and they wouldn't care whether or not each other died because they didn't have any human value. And they would also maximize how they looked at 1 to 60. They would constantly take these pills to keep themselves looking young. And it was interesting because one person who was in this group accidentally found herself over in the savage group, and she accidentally aged, and she ended up committing suicide at the end of her life because she just could not handle this. Well, actually, she ended up dying, I should say, not committing suicide. She ended up dying at the end of her life. I forget if it was suicide or how she died because I didn't get to the very end of the book. Again, I read it when I was in my teens, and now I just reread almost all of it, about 3/4 of it. And they would maximize pleasure and do stuff like that. So anyway, that's the idea. And that's how that book went. And it was pretty weird, but it was very prescient of Aldous Huxley because you can see plastic surgery. You can see all kinds of women today trying to figure out how they can look young, injecting Botox and cow stuff into their own faces. They do all kinds of stuff, try to keep young. You can see movie stars puffing up their lips and everything else. What we also see today is, and I've seen this with a number of atheists, is the focus in ethical consequentialism instead of deontological ethics. So consequentialism is a focus on the consequences of actions to determine whether or not the actions are ethical. And the idea is you want to maximize the greatest good to the greatest number of people. It's utilitarianism in a way. And consequences is also focused, if you look at the Sam Harris and his book on the moral landscape, he talks a lot about minimizing harm and maximizing pleasure. Okay, so this whole idea of maximizing pleasure today, especially to many atheists and many people who want to maximize their own pleasure, they want to minimize sacrifice, and they can't stand the idea that we have a world where we all suffer. Buddha observed that there's human suffering. It just goes on and on and on. And he was basically talking about that's what life is. But this is an idea today is where people don't want to suffer at all. They want to maximize pleasure. They want to maximize hedonism. They don't want to have to make sacrifices. A lot of people who are in that universal basic income idea where they think that the government owes them money and should pay them enough to just live on their own. This is something that would also be the idea of maximization of hedonism. And it also goes very similarly to when Klaus Schwab and others in the World Economic Forum basically said that by the year 2030, we're all going to be happy. They're going to basically this idea of universal basic income. Everyone's going to rent. No one's going to own everything and everyone's going to be happy. And that goes against basically basic property rights. And also, of course, somebody will own everything. And that's the idea of people like Klaus Schwab and other very wealthy people in the world. They would be, of course, bringing us back to societies and where there is the two groups instead of three groups. Right now, we have a middle class, an upper class, and a lower class. We have maximized the middle class through capitalism. The idea from this belief system is that you're going to maximize you're going to maximize the size of the peasantry, which would be a ton of peasants like it was back in the Dark Ages. And we would have basically the kings or the lords and the peasants. And so the idea is, of course, Klaus Schwab and others would be like the lords. And in the book, Brave New World, we, of course, saw the people who were considered the alpha plus. They were the highest levels of society, and they were the ones who were sort of lording over all others. We also see cultures where we have a focus on indulgence versus restraint. And so that's an idea where you indulge a lot. And the United States has been cited as a culture where there is a lot of indulgence. And Mexico also is one. Take a look at Gert Hofstede and his work on cultural values, and look at where the indulgence is incredibly high. We also see the focus on hard work is really important. All throughout the Bible, it talks about how we should work hard. And laziness is scorned upon throughout the Bible. And of course, laziness is something that's sort of maximized in Brave New World and also with some people. Some people don't want to work very hard and they want government handouts, and that's a problem. So Captive Death says nirvana is the cessation of suffering. Yeah, nirvana is the cessation of suffering. If you believe nirvana, you could take it from the Hindu belief system, but I take nirvana as maybe another word for heaven through the Christian lens, and heaven definitely is cessation of suffering. And also in this book, it was sexually perverted. People would have constant sex partners in that book, and you can see that going on today since the 1960s. It's interesting that Aldous Huxley had such prescient notions about this, writing back in 1932, because in the 1960s, we had what they called the sexual revolution and this idea of birth control and a lot of stuff that had come about in the pill all were invented at that point. And it sort of, what women said, freed them up so they could have multiple partners. And of course, that also gave rise to people terminating their own pregnancies, if you want to call it that. I'm just using the word that I will not use here because YouTube likes to censor. But that was going against the idea of purity and holding out for the marital relationship. We also see today a lot of people mutilating their own bodies, thinking they are their own gods. They can create what they want out of their body instead of understanding that God has, again, made them man and woman. So that's a big problem. The body is considered, according to St. Paul, a vessel for God. So that's something that's very important. And we have seen through the centuries a devaluation of human life. We saw it through that book. It's very clear in the book when you have a caste system, there's one caste devaluating the other caste. But we also saw it through the human history with slave systems and the devaluation of human life versus intrinsic human dignity. Now, what St. Paul said is neither slave nor free. We're all valuable in the eyes of God. And then there's the focus on lies versus the truth. So if you feel like you're in a culture where you're told you're forced to tell a lie, like, for example, forced to tell a lie about another person that you see pretending to be something that he or she is not, that's a lie. Just don't do it. Don't do it. Listen to what Alexander Solzhenitsyn had to say about this kind of stuff. Now, who is he? You know, what's really sad is when I ask my students if they've read the book Gulag Archipelago, which was written by Alexander Solzhenitsyn in the last century. Many have not. In fact, it's a rare case where a student has read that book, which is a super shame. But Alexander Solzhenitsyn lived in the Soviet Union, and he was captured unfairly and imprisoned, thrown into the gulags. And so what he did is he spent his life interviewing other people and their experiences inside of the gulags. And while he was doing that, he discovered many interesting things about the human mind and about the value of courage and perseverance, and how Russia had developed very, very strong souls, okay, soul building. And he did everything he could. He created this book, and the book got out into the West, thankfully. And it wasn't until then, until the 1970s, 1960s, 1970s, when the world opened up its eyes to the horrors of the USSR and the Holodomor that took place as a purposeful starvation of people in Ukraine in the early 1930s. And so we saw some purposeful starvation, hundreds of thousands, in fact, millions of people died. They estimate up to 120 million people died under communism, which really is very similar to the Brave New World. It's a devaluation of human life. It's the abolition of property rights and devaluation of human life and subservience to the government. Okay, so it's very similar to what you saw in that book. And so Alexander Solzhenitsyn got up in front of Harvard, and he kind of horrified people when he said a lot of the stuff that he said, because he realized that the Americans had grown very soft. And he saw that the value of being soft was not going to help basically with soul building. And here's what he said. He said, the simple step of a courageous individual is not to take part in the lie. One word of truth outweighs the world. And so in the Soviet Union, they would have you purposely lie. You had to lie about your neighbors. You lied about your own family. You lied to keep yourself safe. And Alexander said, no, I'm not going to contribute to the lie. I'm not going to lie that communism actually works. Communism, again, is the abolition of human rights. It's the abolition of human motivation as well. So imagine if I told my students, it doesn't matter how hard you work in my class, no matter what, everyone's going to get a C. Well, in the first semester, in the first couple of weeks, you might see everyone putting in a certain amount of work, and they find out, wait a second, it didn't matter how hard or how I didn't work, we're all getting a C. Then the quality will deteriorate even more. The quality of their output would turn into a D and eventually an F. That's exactly what communism did to production, okay, to production, especially as witnessed in China, when they would divide up these little plots of land and say, okay, all of you are responsible to farm this land. People realized that unless they had individual accountability for particular portions or parcels of the land, that it didn't matter how hard they worked. So it basically destroyed human motivation. Human motivation's really important, okay? As a professor who's taught human motivation through classes like leadership and human resource management and cultural behavior and those kind of classes, ethics, that sort of thing, you could see the value of human motivation and what it does to societies and how it benefits societies. And they destroyed that. In fact, the Chinese came to realize the reason why the Chinese allowed private properties, started allowing more rights and allowing the West to do trade in China starting around the 1970s is because they saw what happened in one little plot of China. According to Francis Fukuyama, they had divided up those little parcels of land, and there was one little plot where people subdivided the land and each took charge of their little subdivisions. And that was the most productive piece of land all throughout this whole area of China. And the Chinese realized, wait a second, there is some value and to individual human motivation. And so they did allow some of that in there. Even though communism is still thriving in China, Xi Jinping is an authoritarian with all sorts of stuff that's very reminiscent of 1984, another book that's also very prescient by George Orwell. Big Brother watching you. Oh, yeah. A social credit score. Oh, yeah. That's China. And if we don't watch it, that's how we'll be here in the United States. So here's also what Solzhenitsyn had to say, in case you're curious. I want to say hi to Captive Desk again. Alexander said, you must understand the leading Bolsheviks who took over Russia were not Russians. They hated Russians. They hated Christians. Driven by ethnic hatred, they tortured and slaughtered millions of Russians without a shred of human remorse. It cannot be overstated. Bolshevism committed the greatest human slaughter of all time. The fact that most of the world is ignorant and uncaring about this enormous crime is proof that the global media is in the hands of the perpetrators, okay? And we still see that today. All right. We're still seeing what's going on today. We're seeing our society degrading. We're seeing terrible things going on online, unfortunately. PORN. I won't say it because, again, I'll get some sort of weird censoring. But there's a lot of terrible stuff. Yeah. And the precursor, as Alexis is pointing out, is definitely the French Revolution. Definitely was a precursor to communism and fascism. So what is fascism? Well, we saw that exemplified in Italy and in Germany. Fascism is kind of the idea of also a militaristic takeover in some ways, and also sort of valuing one race over another race. And that's what you saw, of course, in Nazi Germany. Nazi is short for the National Socialists. Interestingly, some people fail to realize socialism is part of that, which is a form of communism. And it's a little lighter than communism because it doesn't believe in the complete abolition of property rights, but I digress. But anyway, so that is something that happened, though, is we have this idea of communism, the abolition of property rights, and that kind of thing coming from there. Now, what else did Solzhenitsyn say? Here's his one beautiful quote here with Solzhenitsyn. So here's what he also had to say over a half century ago. While I was still a child, I recall hearing a number of old people offer the following explanation for the great disasters that had befallen Russia. Men have forgotten God. That's why all this has happened. Since then, I've spent well nigh 50 years working on the history of our revolution. In the process, I have read hundreds of books, collected hundreds of personal testimonies. I have already contributed 8 volumes of my own toward the effort of clearing away the rubble left by that upheaval. But if I were asked today to formulate as concisely as possible the main cause of the ruinous revolution that swallowed up some 60 million of our people, I could not put it more accurately than to repeat, men have forgotten God. That's why all this has happened. Don't forget God. Put God at the center of everything that you do. As one of my favorite videos with Denzel Washington, when his graduation commencement, he got up there and his very first words are, put God first. In everything that you do, put God first. And what are the 10 commandments? A very first one, love the Lord above all else. Love him with all your heart and all your mind and all your soul. That's very important. Also, when Jesus said we have 2 commandments to follow, he basically condensed the commandments all into 2. Love the Lord above all else. Love him with your heart, your whole soul, your whole mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. You could take those, and that will explain every single commandment that's out there. So once you value God, now the question is, do people all know that God exists? Well, Romans 1:20 makes it quite clear that everyone knows that God exists. Okay. God, is something that you can tell by just looking outside. You can tell by looking up into the skies. You can tell by looking out into a sunflower. You can tell by the Fibonacci sequence that you see prevalent throughout sunflowers, seashells. You can see it in the cosmos. You can see it in our fingerprints. You can see that God has put his print on us, and it's made it very obvious to us that he exists. But yet some are still going to deny that he exists. And when they do, God gives them a powerful delusion. And that leads to their reprobate minds. It's really unfortunate. Now, sometimes people can snap out of that. And you can pray for them to do so. And we should definitely do that. So Harry Stark says, everyone knows about the anti-Christian Voltaire, but no one knows about the pro-Christian genius Joseph de Maistre or Edmund Burke or Thomas Reed. Yeah, we have that's the sad thing. It's interesting in the book. I'm trying to remember the name of the atheist that Bernard Shaw. Yeah, George Bernard Shaw. They had in Brave New World, that's the mention of the atheist, and it's like his book. And it was interesting in there. They also talked about getting rid of history, very similar to how the communists did that. In China, they basically decided that they didn't want to teach history in the schools of the Chinese history because they wanted to sort of create their own history. And the same sort of thing happened in Brave New World. It was so prescient and incredible that Aldous Huxley was able to see all of that. And Nirvana is analogous to the nihilistic view of hell. So, I guess I'm not terribly familiar with what Nirvana is. I thought it was like a heaven, but if it's not, I'm not sure. But yeah, it could be that. Now, the Christian belief is that there is value to life, and that there is a beginning and that there's an end. And the end of life on the earth leads to life of our souls. Our souls don't end life. Our souls are created at conception, and human value is also created at conception, and our souls live on. And so the question is, how do our souls live on after we pass from this life to the next? Well, that's up to us, and it's up to us to spend our lives as God has instructed, okay? So, Alexis Correll says, what started America's overall policy of neutrality was the reign of terror. So, yeah, it's sad is we've really been in so many wars here in the United States, or we've contributed to a lot of wars. We have been neutral on some things, but actually we've taken sides on a lot else. We took sides during World War II, as you can see that was thankfully, we ended up winning. But that's an issue. Now my dog is starting to act up. So Gus Gomez says, when a human being fears the Lord, a great disaster had befallen Russia. Men have forgotten God. That's why all this has happened. Yes, exactly. Gus, I don't know if you're just joining us, but I had just put that up there on the board. So yeah, that's Alexander Solzhenitsyn really saw a lot. In fact, if you get nothing out of this video and you haven't read that book, please go read that book, Gulag Archipelago. It'll open your eyes to communism and how incredibly evil it was. In case you think that this can't happen again and history can't repeat itself, well, I don't know. Take a look at Venezuela. Venezuela was once the wealthiest South American country, okay? Had lucrative industries, including the oil industry. And then you get a maniac like Hugo Chavez, who comes in there in the late 1990s and starts exalting what he calls socialism. And basically the government starts supplementing a lot of things like gasoline and other kinds of things like that, supplementing your basic bills, supplementing electricity. But then what they decided to do was also take over many industries. And they took over the oil industry, ran it into the ground. Chavez put his own people in there. They didn't know how to run it, so they ran it into the ground, took over transport, took over communication, took over a number of other very important industries. Okay, and what happens with that kind of thing? That's really communism. Communism is the abolition of private property and takeover by the government. And so what happened now is over 90% of Venezuelans are literally starving. They're impoverished. Again, a very wealthy country. Many people have fled. They've been forced to flee. And according to some, people actually have eaten some of their house pets out of desperation. And so it's really a terrible situation. So Gus Gomez says, history is already repeating itself. China already has concentration camps and no one cares. Yeah, okay. That is a really important point. So apparently, I believe it's around, I forget exactly what the number is right now. I want to say 1.8 million people who are ethnic Uyghurs, which are Muslims, have been imprisoned in China. And no one is looking, no government is paying attention to this. It's awful. I know human rights organizations have focused on it, but people are afraid to stand up to China. And unfortunately, these people are being sterilized, forcibly re-educated. All kinds of terrible things are going on there. And the world isn't paying attention to it. The world's looking the other way. And so that's a big problem. That's a big problem right now. And how did that start? Well, it started because apparently a couple of suicide bombers, or homicide bombers, I should really call them, a couple of crazy Muslims decided to act up in a very terrorist way. And rather than just punish them, China went after every single person who is a Muslim and locked them up. And so that's a huge problem. So president doesn't think he has to follow the Constitution. We can agree that dictators are bad. President Trump does follow the Constitution. I don't really like to talk about politics so much on my channel. I do once in a while. I talk about politics, but I was realizing that it's not really I don't study politics like some people. So if you really want to pay great attention to politics, I recommend some other channels probably for that. But what I can say is I'm actually, with a couple exceptions on a couple of policies that Trump has had, I'm pretty pleased with a lot of the things that he's done. I see some good stuff coming in our future. I like the fact that he's been able to trim out the borders, control our borders a little bit. I think that we should have murderers and assassins return to their countries where they came from. I don't see a reason to keep them here and let them murder and assassinate people here. It doesn't seem to me a good purpose for that. So that's the deal. So anyway, I want to say thank you everybody for coming in here today. Please like and subscribe and do come again. And just remember, whether you eat, drink, or whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God. Thank you, everybody.